Hi everyone, welcome back to Mission 1820 and this week's episode of Have You Ever Wondered? As always, if you're just joining us, we've been in a series called Books of the Bible, where for the past 57 weeks, we've been giving introductions into each book of the Bible in just 5 minutes or less. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get into this week's book. This week, we are in the book of 2 Timothy. This is the second of the 3 pastoral epistles that were written by the Apostle Paul. And these include 1 Timothy, which we covered last week. We have 2 Timothy, which we're covering now, and then Titus, which we'll cover next week. These letters are called the pastoral epistles because they deal with matters that affect pastors and their congregations. The book of 2 Timothy is the second of the 2 epistles that were addressed to Timothy, who was a young pastor that Paul was mentoring. And the book was written around AD 67 during Paul's second imprisonment in Rome shortly before his death. Now, Paul, being aware of his impending death, he writes with a sense of urgency and finality so that he could encourage Timothy to remain steadfast in his faith and ministry despite the challenges. Paul encourages Timothy to guard the gospel, to endure suffering, and to continue teaching good, sound doctrine. And Paul also encourages Timothy to rekindle the gift of God within him and not to be ashamed of the testimony about the Lord or of Paul, who is imprisoned, while also encouraging Timothy to join in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. The book of 2 Timothy is a really short book because it has only 4 chapters and it can be broken down into 2 easy parts. Now, part 1 is persevere in present testings. This is in chapters 1 and 2. Part 2 is endure in future testings. This is chapters 3 and 4. And these chapters are providing an appropriate summary of the essential conduct of a pastor of the gospel. When Paul was writing this letter to Timothy, he understood that the ministry would only become more difficult for him with Paul's impending death. And we know that at some point after this letter from Paul, Timothy himself was imprisoned for his own faith. Paul knew that Timothy's task of keeping the church within the bounds of sound doctrine while encouraging believers to live their lives well for the sake of Christ would often be a thankless and very difficult task for him. Though hardship would come, Paul wanted Timothy to continue in those things that he had learned, drawing on the rich heritage of faith that had been passed down to the young pastor, and not just from the Apostle Paul himself, but also from Timothy's mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois. Unfortunately for Timothy, it wasn't long after Paul wrote this letter that he was beheaded by Roman officials on the orders from the Roman Emperor Nero. You see, Nero had falsely accused the Christians of causing the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 that burned half the city to the ground. This allowed Nero to essentially use Christians as scapegoats and to persecute them. And this is what Paul was eventually caught up in. So how can we apply this book to our own lives? 2 Timothy stands as a stark reminder that Paul's influential life and mission were marked by persistent challenges, sufferings, and struggles. As Christians following Jesus, it involves risk and sacrifice. It means inviting tension and discomfort into our own life. But what we need to remember is that these things are not a sign of Jesus' absence in our life, but rather it's precisely in those dark and difficult moments that Jesus' love and faithfulness become most tangible for us. So with that, I hope that this introduction will get you started in the book of 2 Timothy. So God bless, and thanks for watching.